In this video, I'll be replacing the fuel pump and fuel filter on a 1988 Porsche 944, as well as discussing some common problems associated with these components. Some signs that you may have a failing fuel pump include hard start and no start conditions, intermittent engine stalling, misfiring, sputtering, or a rough idle, uneven acceleration or power loss, a decrease in fuel economy, and loud whining sounds at the area of the fuel pump. Before we get into the repair, let's take a look at the primary system components and some common issues that can arise. These parts are laid out here as they appear on the car, starting from the fuel tank in the rear and moving towards the front end. First, we have the inlet line that connects the fuel tank strainer to the fuel pump, and some clamps to secure it at both ends. Next is the fuel pump itself, along with a rubber housing and a retaining clamp. The rubber housing provides the fuel pump with some vibration resistance and noise reduction benefits. At the other end of the pump, we have a check valve, some copper crush washers, the outlet line to the fuel filter, and an end cap for the banjo fitting. When purchasing a new fuel pump, a check valve will often come pre-installed, where it acts to maintain back pressure in the system so that it remains primed for ignition. The other end of the outlet line connects to the fuel filter, after which the fuel is sent to the front of the car, where it feeds the fuel rail and the injectors. The filter captures solidified particles moving throughout the system, thereby protecting the injectors from potential clogs and failures. As for common issues that can occur with these components, the OEM Bosch fuel pumps are actually pretty reliable, but there are a couple situations where they can fail prematurely, the first of which is caused by a clogged fuel filter. As the filter operates and builds up a collection of material over time, the fuel pump will become overworked and will eventually fail. So if there's no history of a fuel filter replacement on your car, it's a good idea to go ahead and do that while you're here. The second potential failure is caused by disintegration of the fuel strainer that's installed at the base of the fuel tank. The strainer is constructed of thin plastic screens that will break down and allow solidified fuel deposits to enter the fuel pump, causing it to seize. So again, this is a great time to replace that component for the overall health of the system as well. The remaining issues tend to arise in the area of the check valve and the banjo connection at the fuel pump outlet. The check valves can also become clogged, and when they do, they fail to maintain back pressure in the system, usually resulting in a hard start condition. And finally, the banjo connections are notorious for developing fuel leaks when working with these components, so it's important to replace all the crush washers every time these parts are disconnected and reconnected, and that everything is tightened down for a proper seal. Now that we have an understanding of how the main system components work together, let's get into the repair and see where everything is located on the car. We'll be working under the car in the area of the fuel tank, so the car should first be placed on jack stands or ramps. With the car raised, go ahead and disconnect the battery negative cable and position it off to the side where it won't contact the battery terminal. Below the rear of the car, on the right-hand side, you'll find the lower section of the fuel tank and the components we'll be working with. On later 944s like this one, we can see that the tank features a metal cover that will need to be removed before we can begin working on the system. The cover was not included on the earlier 944 models, where the fuel pump is simply clamped off to the right of the fuel tank next to the inner wheel well for easy access. Next, we'll remove the rear inspection panel from the cover by removing the two Phillips head screws holding it in place. And now we can get a look at the fuel pump. Depending on prior work that's been done back here, the fuel pump may or may not be clamped to the bottom of the cover, and if it's not, removal will be just a little easier, as we'll see in a moment. To lower the cover, the metal retaining strap will need to be removed. It's secured by one 13mm bolt near the wheel well at the front right corner of the fuel tank. With the bolt removed, the strap can be dropped down and set aside. At this point, if the fuel pump isn't clamped in place, the entire metal cover can simply be lowered to reveal the system components. On the other hand, if the factory system is still in place, the pump will be clamped down, and more than likely the clamping hardware will be inaccessible, in which case the metal cover, the fuel pump, the wiring, and the outlet line can all be removed as one assembly. To do so, first apply a set of hose clamp pliers to the supply line from the fuel tank, and then loosen the hose clamp at the base of the fuel pump with a screwdriver. The pump can now be disconnected from the supply line. Just be prepared to catch and dispose of any fuel that leaks out during the process. From here, you may be able to create some additional space by pulling the fuel tank cover down slightly to access the fuel pump clamp for removal, but if not, we can move on to disconnecting the electrical connector for the fuel pump wiring harness. Lastly, the outlet line can be disconnected from the fuel filter, which is clamped to the bottom of the transmission carrier. This fuel line connection uses a 17mm wrench to turn the nut, while the fuel filter connection is held in place by a 19mm wrench for counter leverage. Again, plan for some fuel to leak out as the line is disconnected, after which point the entire assembly can be lowered away from the car. From here, you'll have easy access to the fuel pump clamp and the wiring connections so that everything can be transferred over to the new fuel pump for installation. After removing the fuel pump clamp with a screwdriver, the wiring harness can be disconnected from the pump. Here you'll find two connections where the brown ground wire is secured with an 8mm nut and the black and green positive wire with a 7mm nut. Next, the banjo fitting can be removed from the check valve at the end of the pump, Again, we'll use a 19mm wrench to separate the banjo by loosening the cap nut, and a smaller 17mm wrench applied to the check valve housing for counter leverage. If you'd like to reuse the old rubber fuel pump housing, it can be removed by either pushing it off or cutting it off of the old pump with a bit of effort. You may have success by placing a deep socket on the aluminum fuel pump inlet and then prying and pushing the rubber housing down and off of the pump. And with the old fuel pump removed and everything disconnected, we can begin the installation process. The installation process is the reverse of removal, so once you have the fuel pump housing swapped over per your preference, the outlet line with the banjo fitting and cap nut can be reconnected to the check valve. Make sure that a new set of crush washers are used for the installation, one being placed on each side of the banjo. The torque specification for this fitting is 22 Newton meters or 16 foot-pounds, where counter leverage is applied using a 17mm wrench on the end of the fuel pump. These crush washers are part number N0138122, with measurements of 12 by 15.5 by 1.5 millimeters, and it's good to have a few of these on hand for this application. If the old washers are reused or the fitting not properly torqued, it will result in fuel leaks at this location, so take special care to do it right the first time. The next step is to reconnect the wiring harness to the fuel pump, where again the brown ground wire is attached to the larger 8mm terminal and the black and green positive wire to the smaller 7mm one. With the wires reconnected, the rubber boots can be pushed back into place to protect the terminals. The other end will plug into the wiring harness on the car once the fuel pump is back in place. From here, the pump and the housing can be clamped back down to the bottom of the fuel tank cover, and the assembly will be ready for installation. Raise the fuel pump and cover assembly back into position below the fuel tank and reconnect the feed line from the tank to the pump. With the fuel line fully seated, tighten down the hose clamp with a screwdriver. After reconnecting the fuel pump wiring harness, the outlet line from the pump can be connected to the fuel filter. In this case, I'll be replacing the filter as well, so we'll go ahead and disconnect the outlet line from the other end of the filter, this time using two 19mm wrenches to remove the fitting. From here, the fuel filter ring clamp can be loosened with a screwdriver, the old filter removed and the new one installed in its place. Pay special attention to the direction of flow indicator marked on the fuel filter housing, where the arrow should be pointing towards the outlet connection that leads to the front of the car. Next, reconnect the fuel lines to the filter by installing the nuts firmly on both sides using the double wrench setup for leverage. With everything reconnected, the hose clamp pliers can be removed from the feed line, and now the system checked for leaks. Before we completely reassemble the fuel tank cover and close everything up, we'll check for fluid leaks by pressurizing the system. We'll first need to reconnect the negative terminal to the battery and tighten it down. At this point, you can either start the engine and let it run for a minute while inspecting the fuel lines and connections for leaks, or you can simply provide power to the fuel pump by applying a jumper wire to pins 30 and 87B for the DME fuel pump relay at position G5 on the central electrical panel. With this method, it's a little easier to hear the pump running and circulating fluid throughout the system. Once you've confirmed that the new connections are all sealed up and ready to go, the tank cover retaining strap can be reattached with the 13mm mounting bolt, and the inspection door reinstalled at the rear of the cover. And with that, you'll have successfully replaced the fuel pump and filter on your Porsche 944.